Ever wondered how trailblazing risk leaders navigate uncertainty with finesse and confidence? Uncover the surprising connections between their personal journey and professional prowess, and get ready to learn and elevate your risk management game with the RiskMasters podcast. Join host Julien Haye in collaboration with Risk.net as they delve into hidden gems of risk leadership through engaging conversations and thought-provoking insights from board directors to chief risk officers and business leaders.
Bonjour, and welcome to the fourth episode of RiskMasters with Michele Wucker. Michele is a renowned strategic advisor, global economic policy expert, and author of the critically acclaimed book The Gray Rhino. Michele brings a wealth of experience to discuss the captivating world of risk management, decision-making, and the concept of the Gray Rhino. In this episode, you will discover 1. Michele's career path and evolution from a former media and think tank executive to an acclaimed writer and strategist. 2. The concept and significance of the Gray Rhino in risk management, and 3. Her insights into the future of risk management. You will find more information on my website, avtm.com, including the transcript and the notes of today's episode, as well as tons of thought leadership articles on risk management. Now, more about Michele. Michele Wucker is a founder of the Chicago-based advisory firm Gray Rhino and Company, and the author of The Gray Rhino and its sequel, You Are What You Risk. Her work focuses on strategic advisory and global economic policies. She works at the nexus of policy, behavioral science, and business strategy. Her approach is unique in that it integrates these diverse areas to provide comprehensive insights into risk management and decision-making. Her personal interest and experience play a critical role in her approach to understanding and communicating complex risk management concepts. And now, here is Michele. Michele, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Today I have the pleasure of welcoming you on that fourth episode of RiskMasters. You have a fantastic background. I'm not going to cover everything you do, but you're a strategic advisor and a global economic policy advisor. You're the founder of the Chicago-based advisory firm Gray Rhino and Company, and you're also the writer and author of the acclaimed book The Gray Rhino and its sequel, You Are What You Risk. So with that, today we are going to look a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are today and everything you've accomplished. Then we are going to deep dive a little bit more on what you do today. Before we explore in more details the intricacies of the Gray Rhino and what that practically means in terms of risk management. But before we get there, my first question to you is how did you get to where you are today? How have you done everything you've done?
Such a tough question. I think, it's been about finding some sort of balance between plans, being very organized and analytical, but also learning to be spontaneous and flexible and pick opportunities, which, to be honest, has been the harder of the two parts of that. I grew up in the US, in Kansas City, Wisconsin, Texas. We moved a lot, so you would be surprised at how different those three places are culturally. So very early on, I became adept at navigating different cultural situations. My mother was born in Belgium. I spent the summer after high school. I spent a month in Belgium with family there and a month in Germany on an exchange program. And that got me the travel bug, the learn about the world bug. And I became fascinated in sort of big picture questions around culture and language and political systems. What differences make it impossible to get along? Are there any differences that make it impossible to get along? So I started out in Latin America, writing about the relationship between Dominican Republic and Haiti, inspired by my time in Belgium. After that, I started writing about finance, about the restructuring of all the defaulted debt from the 1980s and the trading of it throughout the 1990s, when I started working for Dow Jones and then became an analyst at International Financing Review. And although my original training was in journalism, I very quickly realized that I was not a journalist, that I was interested in some of these big picture, systemic, analytical questions that are really a different part of the brain. So I went on to writing books. I went on to several turnaround situations, actually, and running a think tank in New York. I moved to Chicago in 2014 to be closer to family. My great-grandparents met here more than 100 years ago. And after time at another think tank, I realized that I wanted to be working on this gray rhino idea, this question of why do some people see a big scary thing coming at them and deal with it and other ones don't? And I realized it was a big enough question to occupy all of my time. And I'm much happier thinking and sharing insights than dealing with day-to-day organizational office politics and dynamics. And so I guess I've gotten here by getting bored very quickly, figuring out how to pull together all of these different strings of my life from psychology, sociology, anthropology, behavioral science, history, finance. I'm a big finance and economic development geek, but also very interested in social and political dynamics. So pulling together what might seem like very disparate threads in the beginning, but making a whole picture and then talking about that in a way that lots of people can make sense of easily in a small amount of time.
How do you juggle so many activities? Because you have so many strings in parallel of each other. And how do you balance that out?
Well, the real secret is having a dog, which is probably not the answer you expected. But I live right on Lake Michigan. I mean, the water of the lake laps up against my building. I mean, right on Lake Michigan. And so I take Billy for a walk along the lake, weather permitting, every morning. And I had a dog when I was younger, when I was in college, and then didn't for many years until 2001. And that opened up all sorts of possibilities because it sort of forces me to take some time to walk in the park. And I would find that if I were at an impasse in thinking about something, trying to figure something out, I'd go and walk in the park with my dog and get the fresh air. And all of a sudden, boom, it just, the ideas would flow loose. And so that's how I really learned that doing highly creative work, doing systems thinking requires some time when you are exercising and breathing fresh air and building into your schedule time to let it all sink in and marinate. And when I cook, I love to cook stews. So it's like at least like a similar process. And so it's a combination of allowing the downtime in with understanding what really excites me and what is important, but also listening to what people are asking for. After I wrote The Gray Rhino, everyone asked, how can I apply this to my personal life? Which I struggled with because I'm a finance and policy and strategy geek. I'm not really a self-help writer, but I felt like I needed to respond, and I did, and I actually realized that there's a huge connection between personal psychology and behaviors and patterns and bigger corporate or political decisions. And so I pulled that back into my work, and I feel that my work is stronger for it. And then I realized that it's hugely applicable in decision-making situations and dynamics. I've been in a number of high-level task force, study groups on some very contentious issues, particularly immigration, and often found myself being the person trying to pull the different sides together to try to move things forward. So it's, I think it's a combination of art and science, really.
I think it is. And I suspect the pandemic must have been, and lockdown must have been very difficult for you as well in that context.
Well, it's very interesting. I was writing You Are What You Risk. I was supposed to finish it about 6 months before I did. And then the pandemic started, and my publisher in China asked me to write specifically about the risk in the context of COVID. And I realized there was a lot more reporting that I needed to do COVID specific. So it actually worked out quite well. But the thing about COVID and all of the stay at home sheltering in place orders was if there's any time that's good to be stuck inside to write a book, that was it. So it was sort of a blessing in disguise. And the pandemic also really drew a lot of attention to gray rhino theory. All these politicians were coming out and saying, oh, black swan, nobody could have seen it coming. And it just blew my mind. You know, Bill Gates, 2015 TED Talk, so many health organizations and think tanks. And, you know, there had been a simulation done within the US government months before it started. So how could all these people go out and say, oh, nobody saw it coming? I mean, nobody knew exactly what virus, exactly what time, but you don't need to know all of the details to know that you'd better be doing something right now to be prepared. And so when I wrote about that in the Washington Post and it got picked up in the Wall Street Journal and all around the world, and people started saying, oh, hey, yeah, there are these things that we do know about that we're not dealing with. And I said, yeah. And it's funny because Asia picked up on the gray rhino idea right away. And I got a lot of pushback in the United States from people who said, well, if it's obvious, then we're dealing with it. This is not counterintuitive. And I thought, what, this is so counterintuitive, you don't even know it's counterintuitive. You know, we're bad at dealing with obvious things, but not everybody is. And how do you become one of the people who sees the obvious thing and deals with it? And it's counterintuitive that we should actually have to ask that question, but we do. And the pandemic, I think, helped people to be more cognizant of that.
I'd like to move on now to a slightly different aspect. In your book, you mention a quote from Christine Lagarde, who was French Ministre des Finances at the time, where she said that if Lehman Brothers had been a bit more Lehman Sisters, we not have the degree of tragedy we had as a result of what happened during 2008 crisis. And so my question to you is, to what extent you find that your gender has impacted your career, and what's your experience compared to your peers because of your gender?
Well, it's interesting. I remember all the way back to high school when somehow this message was coming across that, oh, women don't like math, women don't like finance. And this little part of me said, oh, yeah. Then, of course, I went to college at Rice, which is a big science and engineering school, even though I was more in social sciences and humanities. But there were lots of brilliant women engineers and mathematicians and physicists coming out of there. But I do remember when I started writing about things on Wall Street, there was a bit of a challenge because my male colleagues would, you know, go out and drink for hours with the traders, and that wasn't something I felt comfortable doing a lot of the times. And, you know, always had to be aware that there were certain tools in place. There were a couple of just jaw-dropping moments throughout time, whether it was, you know, board members saying your title should be executive director, not president, because the president is a much older white man who went to Harvard and has lots of money. You know, but on the other hand, there have been situations where there's been a panel or there's been a group where all of a sudden at the last minute someone realizes, hey, there's no women on this, and because I'm, you know, very versatile and work on a lot of topics that often people don't think about women working on, although luckily that's changing. There's so many women who are just, you know, brilliant leaders in finance, in risk, in board governance, in corporate leadership. You know, that's changing. But there have been times when I've been the only woman in the room because they haven't thought about other women. But I do think that gender, it is important. I suspect that, you know, in hindsight, even better than comparing Lehman Brothers to Lehman Sisters, I think Lehman siblings would have been the best bank of all, because you do need a diversity of perspectives. I found that women and men have some differences in how we deal with risk, but it's not what we think about. We hear all these stereotypes of, oh, women are quote unquote risk averse, which makes my head want to explode. I urge people to say, no, we're risk aware, risk astute. I hear professional women tell me, oh, I'm so risk averse. And then they tell me about their careers. And I say, how? That's risk averse? Seriously? What's risk taking? Because it's pretty spectacular. And I think that some of those stereotypes can be done in a not terribly flattering way. And I think sometimes women are putting themselves down when they say, oh, I'm risk averse, when what they're basically saying is, I pay attention to risks, I'm aware of them, and I do what I can to mitigate them. I'm like, that's not averse, that's just smart.
So now I'd like to move on to what you do today, and how would you describe what you do today? And perhaps we are not going to go through all the many activities you're involved in, but perhaps the key one and what you spend your most time on.
No 2 days are the same. I do a lot of speaking, whether it's virtual presentations or lots of trips to Asia. I gave a talk in Milan earlier this year, really applying some of the concepts that I write about to real world advice, blending this approach to behavioral economics, to decision making, with some of the big macro things that I look at, to helping people ask the right questions about how those affect their strategies, their specific industries day to day. I'm starting to do a little bit more education through the Directors and Chief Risk Officers Institute. I've also been doing a fair amount of teaching with first responders in emergency management, which is quite interesting, and advising a number of companies. So it's a little bit different every day, which is how I like it, because I do get bored easily. I am a very quick study, so if there's something new in the news, I can plug it into my framework and help people to think about it. So I'm trying to move from doing a little bit less speaking and more applied work with company boards and direct advisory, partly because of just I think about all the carbon emissions on the airplane and the health consequences, and the epidemiologists don't even think that COVID was the big one, and I really enjoy seeing the direct impact. In fact, I was at an event yesterday, and I met someone who said, "Oh, you know what? Your work gave me the courage to start my own business." And other people have told me that too. So, because of your work, I quit my job and did something else. And seeing real world impact just makes me so excited. So it's a constant evolution of how I spend my time every day, but I tend to focus it on giving knowledge to other people, helping other people ask the right questions, to think differently, and importantly, to act differently.
Well, it seems the common thread is you're actually helping people, and you're empowering people as well. And I think it's a very good segue to our next question around how do you help decision makers to identify, more importantly, to address under-addressed risks and challenges at macro level and certainly within their organizations?
Yeah, well, it's a bit of a struggle for me, to be honest, because one of the first things people ask when they come to me is, okay, help us identify the gray rhinos. And I have to say, you don't need me to identify them. You already know what they are. I can talk to you about my insights on how maybe some of the global gray rhinos might affect the things that you already know. But what we're really here to do is to take a fresh look at those, to be brutally honest about your response. But it's like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. When the good witch tells her, close your eyes and click your heels and just picture it. It's like that with the gray rhinos. So I always have to preface my answer to what are the gray rhinos with that. You know what they are, and you know them better than I do. Whether it's in your company, it's a succession plan, whether it's a culture issue, whether it's competitive pressures, whether it's finance and liquidity, whether it's a policy or regulatory thing. People pretty much know. Although often companies have a disconnect between the people at the top and the frontline workers and everybody in between. There have been a couple of situations recently where people have said, if you had gone just, one or two rungs further down the corporate ladder, you would have been paying much more attention to this. So one of the things is to encourage companies to create, as you mentioned before, this atmosphere of psychological safety, to create the channels that allow them to hear what they need to hear from everyone, that Gray Rhino theory is appropriate for everyone from the CEO and the board all the way down to the frontline workers, and there should be a flow of information back and forth. I help people to think about the different stakeholders, both people who are affected by whatever Gray Rhino is on their mind, also the people with the power to change it, the relationship between that Gray Rhino and other Gray Rhinos, helping them to really apply an analytical framework to the obvious dangers that are in front of them, so that instead of being the people who ignore them and get trampled, they are the ones who use the strength and realize that the people who recognize the Gray Rhino and use its strength are the ones that are going to create value and come out ahead. Because if they don't, their competitors might. But whoever recognizes the Gray Rhino and deals with it first is going to have the biggest advantage. So a lot of my message is really psychological and analytical, and the Gray Rhino itself is I think it's a tool very much as Aesop envisioned, with all of his fables using animals. It's something to focus your mind and to help you to talk about something that you might not have had the tools to speak about before.
And you mentioned a bit, there's a bit of, actually a lot of education and preparing people, right? And in that context, how do you see education and research advancing the governance in organizations, but also, I would say, in country-wide policies?
I'm really happy to see it advancing. When the Gray Rhino came out in 2016, I went all over the world talking about it, and a lot of risk professionals expressed to me that they were frustrated that people saw them as being in silos. People didn't relate to the things that kept them up at night. And I think particularly in finance and in some of the more traditional uses of risk, they're very quantitative or actuarially focused. And people who aren't, don't have math brains felt a little intimidated by it. And there's a growing recognition of how important the behavioral side is, particularly for operational risks. And people in heavy industries get it. People in finance get it. Governments are they get it on a certain level. I think people in finance get the quantitative part, not necessarily as much of the behavioral part as
I would absolutely challenge you to have discussion with sports on, they get it. As I work for too many organizations that was pouring actually colossal amount of money in trying to fix, I would say, the operational aspect without touching the cultural aspect of the organization.
It's impossible.
And because they didn't touch that, then they were wasting money because nothing was really changing.
Absolutely. And in fact, when I introduced the Gray Rhino concept, it was in January of 2013 at the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos. And the assignment for the panel was actually about weak signals. And of course, my message is, it's not that the signals are weak, it's that the connection, the person with the power to do something about them is not empowered to do it. On the other hand, there is an element of weak signaling in terms of mispricing of risk. And I think some of this has to do with credit agencies, some of it has to do with market behavior, some of it has to do with distortions introduced by central banks. But you look back to the great financial crisis, and you look at the number of subprime mortgage-backed securities that eventually went under, and they were rated investment grade until right at the end. Even you look back to this spring at Silicon Valley Bank, and the ratings weren't downgraded until right before and then right after everything fell apart. So I think a lot of ratings tend to be very conservative and backwards looking. I think Fitch got a lot of flack in August for its downgrade of U.S. sovereign debt, but they said what everybody knew. It's a situation of don't shoot the messenger. And of course, Moody's has now issued some warnings. And to be honest, I think that if if credit rating agencies were more proactive and sent out warning signals earlier on, we might not see problems getting as big as they do. And of course, central bank and other policy interventions in markets play a big deal. I mean, we often see central banks worried about tightening monetary policy when things are going down, but you never hear them talking about tightening monetary policy because financial assets are at the top of the bubble. It's all about wages. It's not about asset price inflation, and I think that's a real big blind spot for central banks. So I really think a big conversation about risk pricing is very much in order, and about how we can not just see interventions when things are about to break on one end or the other, but to come up with a better scheme that encourages good risk taking, discourages bad risk taking, diminishes this uncertainty tax that real world businesses pay because there is so much volatility and so many distortions introduced by policies that are not taking into account some of the unintended consequences.
And I'd like to continue exploring now the Gray Rhino concept. And can you just explain in a nutshell what is a concept and how to apply it to risk management?
So the Gray Rhino is a way to address the question of why some people see a big scary thing coming at them and deal with it, and other people don't. And to remind people that just because something's obvious doesn't mean that you're necessarily dealing with it. It came out of my work in emerging markets finance fairly early on in my career, and then returning to it. I was writing about the Argentinian debt crisis, and about 9 months before everything collapsed, 2001, I wrote about a proposal for a preemptive restructuring, which would have involved a 30 to 35% haircut, and wrote about it in International Financing Review. Lots of very senior bankers working on Latin America, the biggest banks in the world, called me and they said, yeah, we think this is what needs to happen, but we can't say it or we're going to be fired. And so, of course, Argentina did not accept this. Argentina's creditors did not move forward with this proposal. And it was 16 years of litigation, and investors ended up losing 70% of their money instead of 30 to 35%, which by my math was not a really great deal. And so 10 years later, you see Greece in a similar dynamic. The debt's going up, the economy is going down, reserves are going down. And so I wrote a paper called Chronicle of a Debt Foretold, with a little bit of a nod to Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and saying, hey, Greece, don't make the same mistake Argentina did. You have an opportunity, get out of it. So published that paper through the New America Foundation, which was partnering with the World Policy Institute at the time on a World Economic Roundtable. We had some of the smartest people on Wall Street talking about important policy issues at the time. Was a guest host on CNBC Worldwide Exchange. It was one of the first public calls for a preemptive restructuring in Greece. And nearly a year later, that's what happened. And it was at a time where I had was taking an executive education course at the Harvard Kennedy School arranged by the World Economic Forum. And, just you're thinking about what needed to happen next. And I realized I hadn't been writing for a while because I'd been running this organization. And so decided that I wanted to write my next book about this question. Why do some leaders see big scary thing coming at them and deal with it, and other ones don't? I knew it was way bigger than geeky sovereign debt questions, that it had a lot of relevance for corporate strategy, for policy questions, from not just financial crisis, but climate change and all sorts of other things. And so when I was trying to think about how to write it in an accessible way, I was talking with a friend, a very senior corporate M&A lawyer. And I said, it's big, it's scary, it's coming at you. And the rhino and the horn popped into my head. Like a rhino. And so he made a joke about the black swan. He said, you could call it a black rhino. And of course, the black swan is the thing that's so improbable you can't even picture it. And I remembered having gone to the zoo when I was a kid. And I thought, wait a minute, there was such a thing as a black rhino. Or was it a white rhino? Let me go to Wikipedia because I don't really remember. And that's when it struck me that if you ask a 5-year-old at the zoo what color the rhino is, they will tell you the obvious thing. It's gray. But the sign says this is a black rhino or this is a white rhino, which neither one of those is actually that color. And so that part of the metaphor is for some of the assumptions that we make that are wrong, that, oh, because it's obvious, we're dealing with it. And so it's a metaphor to remind people you're probably not looking as clearly as you should at the obvious things in front of you. And you want to be one of the people who gets out of the way or even harnesses the strength of that rhino instead of getting trampled. So it's a challenge for these dynamic, high probability, high impact situations.
And for people listening who like to apply and think about it by themselves for their own environment, whether it's personal, because that can clearly apply at personal level, at the same level it can apply at professional and business level. What signs or indicators should people be looking for to help them realize it's actually there, it's coming toward you, and if you don't move, you're going to be squashed?
Yeah, well, I ask people a very simple question. What's your gray rhino? What's the big thing coming at you? When I do workshops, you start out with, here's a list, or, sometimes people will have identified things ahead of time. These are the top 5 things that I worry about. And then there's an analytical framework for where are you in dealing with this? And where are the other key stakeholders in dealing with it? And so the 5 stages, with a nod to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her 5 stages of grief, start with denial, which is what it sounds like. There's muddling, when you say, yeah, this is a problem, but here's all the reasons why nothing can be done. And then there's a mindset shift to diagnosing, which is where I spend most of my time with clients, which is where you look at, how fast is it going? How big is it going? What are the possible solutions? What do I need to solve this? Who can help me solve this? Of the people who can help me solve this, where are they in this 5-stage framework? And so it's where you're really focusing on what needs to happen and how to get there, where you're making a plan. The 4th stage is panic, which is what it sounds like. People running around and screaming, do something, anybody just do something. I often illustrate it with the Edvard Munch painting, The Scream. And panic is a double-edged sword. It's the time when people are likely to do something, but it's also the time when they're likely to do the wrong thing. And it helps to have a plan in place. But as we saw in Hurricane Katrina, which I wrote about in the Gray Rhino, or as we saw with COVID, there were plans in place, but the mechanisms for those plans to get implemented didn't work. There was a disconnect there. So you need a plan and you need people with the power to do something, which is partly why we see so many conversations about chief risk officers and what role they play and how to empower them. And then the final stage is action, which is also sort of what it sounds like, but it also includes tracking and adjusting. Too many people will say, okay, well, here's the problem. We did something and okay, that's the end of it. But you need to see if what you did worked or not. And if you need to adjust your path to get the results that you want. And God forbid, there are unintended consequences that you need to deal with. Like, for example, all of the quantitative easing and low interest rates to get us through the great financial crisis and COVID, which is now coming back to bite us. So those are the 5 stages.
Well, I suppose it's not only about avoiding the rhino coming at you, but not jumping in a pride of lion sitting next to it.
Well, I often talk about about baby rhinos, but also something called like a crash of rhinos. The English language is just beautiful in the way that the zoological term for a group of rhinos is a crash, which just works on so many levels. But often, a gray rhino will come, and then there will be some other rhinos. Sometimes it's a whole crash of them coming on top of you at once. I mean, like climate change is. And then there's the baby rhinos that are coming behind it and that are starting to get bigger as well.
Staying in that space, right? In an interview last year, you mentioned that think your top three gray rhinos were climate risk, financial fragility, and equality, and also the political situation in the US. So with a few months now, and especially what happened in 2023 and this year, right, which has been quite heavy in terms of events, has at least changed? How do you see the world now?
Well, I've been looking at this sort of triad of gray rhinos for quite some time, and the interaction among them between climate change and financial fragilities, whether that's excessive debt or imbalances, asset bubbles. And then for many years, I'd been talking about inequality, and that sort of kind of changes a little bit. Obviously, what's been going on in US politics is at least partly related to inequality. And now I look at geopolitical tensions as part of that. And I see geopolitical tensions often as the consequence of domestic imbalances interacting with politics 101, you know. So all three of these are related. And I see the political problems in the United States and geopolitical tensions as both symptoms of the problem, but also what I call meta gray rhinos, sort of, systemic problems that get in the way. These tensions within countries and between countries are making it harder for us to solve financial crisis, climate emergency, other problems. And there are lots of great proposals out there. In the United States, I've been paying a lot of attention to ranked choice voting, which is a tool that would ideally, once it's in place, give more power to people that more people can agree on. Because right now, the extremes have the most say. And the more the extremes do, the further disaffected moderates and constructive people are. And the media doesn't always use the word moderate or conservative or liberal in ways that make any sense anymore. But what we really need is to get to a place where people can disagree about policy, but it's not a personal thing. You don't see the insults that you're seeing right now, and people agree to work together even though they have differences of opinion. I mean, that's sort of what democracy is supposed to be about.
And I'd like to explore one last question connected to that, if I may. And you kind of touch on the role of governments in there and policy. How do you see the role of regulation evolving in addressing those type of risks? And what type of changes can we anticipate that will actually benefit society? And you touched on already on some of those aspects around the pricing, for example, could be one. But what else could you see?
Well, regulation is something that obviously businesses look at quite a bit. And it's also often an area where you see unintended consequences. I would like to see regulations focus more on externalities, positive and negative, and it might not necessarily be traditional regulations, but perhaps tax policy, or taking a better look at the kinds of subsidies that are there. And we continue to subsidize fossil fuels, so where taxpayers are paying for that, and then they're paying for the cleanup for the disasters that fossil fuels are creating, which means you're getting double charged. I would like to see much more regulation around safety issues. We're starting to see calls for climate reparations, things like that. I'm particularly keen on food regulation. As anyone who's ever had the misfortune of having a meal with me knows, I have celiac disease, and so food safety is a really, really big one for me. And some of those regulations are designed to provide cover, but not necessarily to make things safe. So I think there's all sorts of areas, but I think if there were really one that I would pick, it would be around externalities, more of a focus on positive externalities, which might change how, say, banking regulators deal with some of the smaller and regional banks that have been so much in the news the last several months. Access to credit type things. I think there's a lot of room for blended finance when there is something that has a very strong social impact argument, in turn leading to economic growth, that if there's a market failure, there is another opportunity for philanthropic or public funds to come in. And I've written a little bit about this in You Are What You Risk. We'll be doing some more work on it. With regulations, I think it's important not to have lots and lots of sudden changes one way or the other. And the other regulatory thing that just drives me nuts is GDPR, which has created all kinds of unintended consequences. It frightens me every time I go to a website and have to, click that opt-in to go to the rest of it, because I don't know what I'm agreeing to. I don't know what I'm clicking on. And so I feel like that has created lots of unanticipated risks. And I think it needs to be updated. And perhaps there are market solutions, in the sense of some sort of, blanket, I agree to only strictly necessary cookies. Any website that pops up has, that's all I agree to. But I think there do need to be some changes to that. And in other cases, I'm sure thousands of examples where regulation is not leading to the desired result and needs to be tweaked so that good intentions don't lead where we all know they lead.
Now I'd like to bring our discussion to a close. I have a couple of additional more questions for you. A simple one. Where can people find more about you?
Best place to start at is my website, thegrayrhino.com. Gray with an A, the E will get you there too. I'm also very active on LinkedIn, and I write occasionally there, not as regularly as I always intend to. Where good intentions lead, but I'm also very, very happy to connect with people on LinkedIn or thegrayrhino.com.
Finally, any final advice for emerging risk leaders and leaders more broadly? Anything they should be doing or avoid doing?
I think emerging risk leaders should start with some real self-awareness. Take a really hard look at yourself. And You Are What You Risk, I talk about your risk fingerprint, which is a combination of your innate personality, the genetic things you can't change, like the arches and whorls on your real fingertip, your lived experience, the shocks, the successful risks, the bets that went wrong, that have shaped how you see the future, depending on your innate personality. It's like the cut on your finger from a knife that will leave an indelible mark on your physical fingerprint. And then finally, your habits, including self-awareness, the people you surround yourself with, the physical environment, the things that you do to optimize your environment for taking risks in a way that best suits who you are. And that might include the industry you work in or the role you work in. I mean, it's like people who do manual labor get calluses on their fingers, whereas people who use super soft, sweet smelling shea butter get super soft fingers. So those are the things that you can change. So think about your own risk fingerprint. Think about what's going into the risk decisions that you are making, because you might not even be aware of some of those things. And once you're aware of what's going into the choices, then you can take risks in a way that's much better for yourself. And you can start to understand why the people around you might be taking some risks and not other ones. And you can start to affect the culture, the relationship with your clients, with your peers, with your investors, with your suppliers. So it starts really with that self-awareness element.
Well, Michele, thank you so much for all of this. It was a real pleasure to have this discussion with you today. I'm sure there's a lot of takeaway for everybody listening to this podcast. And I wish you best of luck and hopefully speak to you soon.
Great. Thank you. It's been so much fun talking with you. Thanks for hosting this great series.
As we conclude our conversation with Michele Wucker, her insights in risk management, particularly the Gray Rhino concept, leave us with much to reflect on. Michele's transition from media to a global risk expert underscores the importance of adaptability and strategic thinking in today's complex world. Her discussion is a compelling reminder of the critical need to acknowledge and address the obvious risks in our environment. So a big thank you to Michele for sharing her invaluable expertise on RiskMasters. To dive deeper into today's episode and access show notes, transcript and more, please visit my website ivtm.com. And remember, keep pushing boundaries, keep having an impact, and never shy away from becoming the master of your destiny. Till the next time.
Thank you for joining us on RiskMasters today. If you're ready to master risk and unleash your full potential, here's how you can take the next steps. First, head over to julienhaye.com to discover even more valuable insights from our RiskMasters. We've got a treasure trove of knowledge waiting for you. Second, don't miss out on future episodes. Hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcasting platform. Stay tuned for fascinating discussions on risk management. And third, if you found today's episode valuable, please share it on social media. Help others discover the world of RiskMasters and embark on their journey of risk mastery. Remember, success favors the bold. See you on the next episode of RiskMasters.